Hello and welcome to my channel. This is the drawing I'm going to be doing today, this charcoal landscape, and I'm going to show you how you can create a realistic and effective scene in just a few simple steps. I'm mostly going to be talking about two things. The first one is creating contrast between the darker elements in the foreground and lighter vague elements in the background. And the second is connecting large shadow areas into a single unified shape to enhance the contrast and capture the attention of the viewer. Let's have a look. Alright, this is my paper, 220 GSM, about 9 times 12 inches in size. I'm going to grab a piece of willow charcoal and do a bit of sketching to work out the composition. I don't need to do too much. I just need to decide where the line of the trees will be and where the line of the water will be, because it's going to be like a scene on a lake or something with some trees on both sides. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is go over the top part of the paper to add a bit of value to make that just a little bit darker. I want to create something that kind of looks like a gloomy, murky sky. Maybe a little bit foggy in the distance. We'll see. So once I added a bit of that willow charcoal, I started blending that with one of the softer brushes, moving that charcoal gently over the surface of the paper, because vine charcoal and willow charcoal, they don't really stick to the paper as much, and you can move the charcoal dust more easily. Now if I feel that this is too light, I can add a little bit more over it. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to go over it gently, and I'm trying to blend it gently so that I wouldn't create too much texture. I want it to look pretty smooth and kind of monotonous, so that the other elements would be allowed to stand out and capture the attention of the viewer. So I want the sky pretty simple and monotonous without any clouds, but just a little bit darker than plain white. And that's kind of what I'm achieving here as I'm blending with a brush. I'm probably not going to be making it any darker than this. So I normally work from left to right, but here I'm maybe going to make a slight exception. I'm going to work on this middle part a little bit. I'm going to add a little more value where the bank will be, and then on top of that I'm going to draw some trees in the distance. So I want these objects in the distance to be kind of slightly vague, like maybe it's a slightly foggy scene, but I want them to fade in the distance a little bit so that I could allow the elements in the foreground to stand out. So I'm going to draw these with the same piece of willow charcoal that I initially used for shading the sky, and I'm just going to draw some random trees, mostly these coniferous trees, where I kind of draw the vertical line first to give myself an idea about the position and the height of the tree, and then I just add some horizontal shapes or horizontal lines to create a conical tapering shape that kind of looks like a coniferous tree. So I'm going to draw a whole bunch of these, and right now they have a lot of texture and they're a little bit darker than you would expect, but once I start dabbing on them with a brush, they're going to get more vague and a bit lighter which is what I want to achieve. So I want these objects in the distance to be kind of vague, almost abstract, and not particularly distracting. I don't want them to be too defined. I want the top edges to be fairly defined against the sky because I want to keep some contrast there. But I'm just going to dab on that lightly with a brush, keeping that shape and keeping some of that contrast between the sky and the trees, but at the same time making sure that there isn't too much contrast and that there isn't any texture, or that there is very, very little texture, because these objects are in the distance, like I said, and I want to make sure that the objects which are closer to our viewpoint are quite a bit darker and more defined in terms of their shape and edges and textures and things like that. So here in the foreground I'm going to be drawing a few taller trees. So I decided to draw a couple more trees here all the way on the left using a piece of willow charcoal, and then to work over that with a charcoal pencil, which is a lot darker, obviously. So when I draw a darker shape like this, what I want to achieve is I want to make these darker shapes, more defined shapes, to push the lighter shapes back into the distance, as it were, to give the viewer that feeling like these objects are further away, and that's why they are less defined, and that's why there is a lot less contrast in them. But these objects in the foreground, they're going to be quite dark, and hopefully that contrast in value between the trees which are closer to us and those which are further away will give the viewer the feeling of depth and distance. And as you can see, I first drew the tree trunk, that vertical line which is kind of tapering at the top, and then I started drawing some of the horizontal shapes, like the branches growing out and some of the clusters of leaves or needles growing on these branches. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can make it kind of random and irregular and asymmetrical. That's fine, because it will still look like a tree, and the more irregular it is, the better it is, I think. And I can also draw some of these random branches growing out to the side and leave some white spaces in between, so that the whole structure of the tree with all of these overlapping branches would look a lot more interesting and a lot more complex and a lot more convincing. So this is a nice looking tree. And by the way, once again, here I'm using a charcoal pencil. For the objects in the background, I actually use that piece of willow charcoal, which is a lot lighter. But for this stuff in the foreground, which I really want to stand out, I'm using a dark, soft charcoal pencil for that. The charcoal pencils I'm using are Kohinoor extra soft charcoal pencils, although I may use a bit of the harder ones a little bit later. But most of the work on these darker areas will be done with this extra soft charcoal pencil, Gioconda Kohinoor charcoal pencil. And the number on it, I think, is 8811/2. That's the one that I'm using. But you know, if you're using a different brand, just you can just find a soft charcoal pencil, and if you work on that against the lighter shapes created with willow charcoal or vine charcoal, you will be able to achieve similar contrast. So you can see, as I'm drawing some of these trees which are kind of in the mid-ground, somewhere in between, I'm drawing some more of them with willow charcoal, but I'm using a bit more pressure, and I'm pushing the charcoal a little bit harder using my blending tools, so that the trees kind of get gradually lighter and lighter in the distance. So that's the first thing that I mentioned in my introduction. I talked about contrast between the darker elements in the foreground and lighter elements in the background. But the other thing is something that we're going to work on now, once I start drawing some more of these darker areas. But first I'm trying to sketch a little bit and work out the shape of some of these rocks which will be in the foreground. So this scene is on a lake or a river. It doesn't really matter. We're going to have some water here, and we're going to have some reflections of that row of trees in the middle and on the right. And there's also going to be some reflections from these rocks. I'm going to make this fairly smooth as well, but a little bit, maybe a little bit darker, with just a little bit more texture than the top part of the paper. So the surface of the water, this bottom part of the drawing is going to be a little bit darker in terms of value. And the part on the left, these rocks, they're going to be quite a bit darker. But I started out by adding a little bit of value just to see how that goes. I used a piece of willow charcoal for that, and then I'm going to be adding some more darker shapes to that using a charcoal pencil. The charcoal pen, by the way, here on the left, I didn't really like the shape here. This tree, which is supposed to be behind the tall tree on the left, so I removed it. I don't know. It didn't really make sense to me, so I decided to remove it. And I also decided to rework this row of trees in the middle a little bit. I decided to add a few more of these taller ones in the middle. But you can vary the height and the positioning a little bit. And this is the bank. I'm not going to add too much detail to that either. And the trees, of course, are going to be reflected in the water. So I started talking about my drawing tools. The charcoal pencils that I'm using are made out of compressed charcoal, and compressed charcoal is a lot darker than vine charcoal and willow charcoal, and it also sticks to the surface of the paper quite a bit more than willow charcoal. And that's why you can create these darker shapes. That's why I thought that it was a good idea to use a combination of these two types of tools. And I normally recommend that whatever charcoal drawings you're drawing, you should probably use a combination of charcoal pencils and vine charcoal in most cases. Sometimes you can just use one or the other, but in most cases it's a good idea to try to combine them. So I drew some reflections here. I'm not sure how good they look. I may fix them a little bit. I also drew some indications of ripples using a pencil eraser. Like I said, I may rework that a little bit later, but right now I just want to focus on these rocks a little bit. I already did a little bit of sketching to try to give myself some idea about what the shapes are going to look like, but I'm gonna start drawing a little bit more detail here to see where that takes me. So this part here that I'm drawing, this darker shape here, that's the reflection. The reflection is going to be just a little bit darker than the rock itself, and we're going to have a bunch of rocks. So I want to draw angular shapes with sharp, jagged edges, uneven edges, and a bit of texture. I'm also adding a bit more of those irregular shapes at the top, just over those, at the top of those rocks, to make it look like there are maybe some bushes and some smaller trees there as well. And now you can see that I'm shading some of the sides of these rocks, because obviously, since the light source is coming from above, the top part or the top side of each and every one of these rocks is going to appear a little bit lighter, and the sides and the bottom is going to be darker. So I'm just going over some of these rocks kind of more or less randomly, trying to trying to see if I could come up with some happy accidents and to see if I can come up with some interesting looking shapes. It doesn't have to look great at first, but I'm just, you can see that I'm adding some more charcoal in some of these areas deliberately to indicate that these are the shadow areas or cracks in between some of these stones and rocks. And after that I'm going to do a bit of blending with my finger. And no, I'm not ruining it because I'm not too concerned about what it will look like eventually. I want this part in the foreground to be fairly dark, so I don't really have to worry too much about ruining some of the details. I can bring them back later using brushes or erasers. I can do that later. And the reason why your finger is a good blending tool in this situation is because the texture of the skin in combination with the natural oils of your skin, that allows the charcoal powder to stick, and it allows you to push the charcoal into the grain of the paper and create some really dark areas, which would otherwise be a little bit lighter if I used brushes and some other blending tools. So I wanted to add a few more darker trees here in the foreground so that I could create even more depth in my scene, and so that I could push these trees in the back even more, so that I could make it look like they are further back behind these rocks. So it's all about trying to create a more three-dimensional looking landscape. And I can rework these shapes a little bit later if I don't like some of the branches and the shape of some of these trees. Now after that I did a bit more blending with a brush on some of these rocks to see what I can come up with. And you can see how I made most of this area in the foreground on the left fairly dark, and there is actually little detail there that you can discern. So this is the second thing that I mentioned in the introduction, and this is joining the larger shadow areas into a single shape. What that does, it allows you to capture the attention of the viewer and allow them to focus on these larger relationships and to focus on these larger shapes, because these larger, darker shapes also help to bring out the larger, lighter shapes. And that's one of the ways that you can make your scene look good even when looked at from a distance. Now here I tried adding just a little bit of texture to some of these rocks by dragging my pencil eraser over some of the lighter portions of these rocks to see if I can come up with some interesting looking textures to make those rocks look a little more stony and rocky. But like I said, I'm not too concerned with every single detail, and I also have a nice reflection in between those rocks, nice reflection coming from those trees in the middle, those darker trees. I also dragged my pencil here, trying to create some additional cracks and some texture in those rocks, but eventually I wasn't really happy with these details, so I decided to maybe simplify that a little bit by just dabbing it a little bit with my finger, leaving some of the texture but removing most of it and kind of fading a lot of that foreground area into this large dark shape. And after that I did a bit of blending on this reflection as well, because I didn't really like the way it looked, so I decided to fix these shapes a little bit so that they match the image of the water a little bit better. I'm sorry that my head is butting in occasionally, but that's because I'm leaning over to work on some of the details. That's one of the disadvantages when you're recording top down. Sometimes you have to move closer to inspect some of the details. I think the reflection looks a little bit better now. I can't really put too much detail and texture in the reflection because then it just won't look like water, and I don't want it to look distracting anyway. I can just add a few ripples or suggestions of ripples and movement of water using a pencil eraser. And the pencil eraser I'm using, by the way, is a Kohinoor eraser and a pencil. So I'm using two erasers, the kneaded eraser and the pencil eraser. So I'm just refining those trees in the distance, both the image above the water and the reflection. And I think I've already established a nice contrast between the part of the scene on the left, which is in the foreground, and the part of the scene on the right. And I'm just softening the reflection a little bit. So this is the finished drawing. I'm just going to put down some finishing touches. I don't want to ruin the edges, but I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to sign the drawing in the lower right corner. And I hope you like this one. It's not a very complex scene, it's easy to do, but I think it looks nice. If you want to see longer videos, you should check out my Patreon. You have full-length narrated videos there. And here on YouTube, you should definitely check out my other videos. I have plenty of landscapes. Also, don't forget to subscribe, give me a like and comment. And I'm going to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.